They thought their daughter loved them, but when 72-year-old Margaret and 75-year-old Thomas stood in the desert watching everything they'd built for 50 years get auctioned off to strangers, they realized the cruelest betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the ones who called you Mum and Dad, and what they discovered while hiding in an abandoned underground mining town wouldn't just save their lives, it would expose the daughter and son-in-law who destroyed them and reveal a fortune so massive it would shake the foundations of everyone who ever turned their backs. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The autumn wind carried dust across the empty parking lot where Margaret Chen stood beside her husband Thomas, watching strangers pick through the remnants of their life. The hardware store they'd run for 43 years was being liquidated. Everything inside, the shelves Thomas had built by hand, the vintage cash register Margaret polished every Sunday, the community bulletin board where 3 generations of families had posted lost dog flyers and babysitting ads, all of it was being sold to the highest bidder. Margaret's hands shook as she clutched Thomas's arm. She wore the same blue cardigan she'd worn on their first date in 1971, though it hung looser now on her shrinking frame. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes, once bright with the kind of warmth that made customers linger just to chat, were hollowed out by months of sleepless nights and tears she refused to let fall in public. Thomas stood silent beside her, his weathered hands hanging at his sides like tools he no longer knew how to use. He'd been a Marine before he became a shopkeeper, and that military posture still held his spine straight even as the world crumbled around him. But his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a man who'd been gut-shot by his own family and was still trying to understand how the bullet got there. "We should go," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't watch them take the workbench." The workbench. The one where Thomas had taught their grandson Bobby how to measure twice and cut once. The one where he'd repaired countless broken toys for neighborhood kids, never charging a dime. The one where he'd held Margaret the night her mother died, both of them sitting on stools at 3 in the morning, surrounded by hammers and hope. Thomas didn't move. He just stared at the auctioneer, a thin man in a cheap suit who spoke too fast and smiled too wide. "Lot 47 Vintage Craftsman Toolbox, complete set. What am I bid?" "Dad, you really should leave." The voice came from behind them, soft and careful, like someone approaching a wounded animal. Margaret turned slowly. Her daughter Emily stood 10 feet away, perfectly put together in a cream-colored blazer and dark jeans. Her blonde hair was styled in soft waves, her makeup impeccable. She looked like she was heading to brunch, not to the funeral of her parents' entire world. "You have some nerve," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut. Emily's face flickered with something. Guilt, maybe, or just discomfort. "I know you're upset, but this was the only way to settle the debts. Daniel explained it all to you." Daniel, the son-in-law, the man who'd shown up 5 years ago with his real estate developer smile and his promises to help the family business grow. The man who'd convinced Emily that her parents were too old to manage their own finances. The man who'd somehow gotten Thomas and Margaret to sign papers they didn't fully understand during a holiday dinner when the wine was flowing and trust was assumed. "Daniel is a liar," Thomas said quietly. His voice was rough, like gravel under tires. "And you know it, Emily. Somewhere inside, you know it." Emily's jaw tightened. "He's my husband. He's trying to help." "Help?" Margaret's voice rose, drawing looks from the auction attendees. "He drained our business accounts. He took out loans using our store as collateral without our knowledge. He forged our signatures on documents that gave him power of attorney. And you," her voice broke, "you stood there and let him do it." "That's not fair," Emily said, but her eyes wouldn't meet her mother's. "You don't understand business. The market changed. The store was failing. Daniel tried to save it." The store was fine until he touched it, Thomas said. We made enough to live on. We employed 6 people. We were part of this community for 4 decades. You were barely breaking even, Emily shot back, living in the past, refusing to modernize. Daniel saw the potential in the property. The location alone is worth— So that's what this was about, Margaret interrupted. The land. He wanted the land, and you helped him take it from us. Emily's face flushed. You're making me sound like a monster. I'm your daughter. I love you. This whole thing just got complicated. Legal issues, tax problems Daniel's been trying to fix. Stop, Thomas said, his voice carrying the command of someone who once led men into combat. Just stop lying, Emily. We know about the sale. We know Daniel already has a buyer lined up for the property. We know he's planning to build condos, and we know the money from this auction isn't going to pay any debts. It's going straight into an account with his name on it. Emily's mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to sit on the store counter doing homework while her parents worked. But that girl was gone, replaced by someone Margaret barely recognized. I have to go, Emily said finally. Daniel's waiting in the car. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Margaret watched her daughter disappear around the corner, and something inside her chest that had been holding on finally let go. We lost her, Margaret whispered. Thomas pulled her close, his chin resting on top of her head. We lost everything. They stood like that for a long time. 2 people who'd built a life from nothing, raised a family, served their community, and played by every rule they were ever taught. And now, at 72 and 75 years old, they had $1,700 in a checking account, a 1998 Ford truck with 183,000 miles on it, and nowhere to live. The bank had foreclosed on their house 2 months ago. They'd been staying in a motel on the edge of town, watching their savings evaporate $29 at a time, every single night. Thomas had applied for jobs, Walmart greeter, grocery bagger, anything. But nobody wanted to hire a 75-year-old man with a bad knee and trembling hands. Margaret had tried too, but her arthritis made it hard to stand for long shifts, and her heart condition meant she couldn't handle stress. What do we do now? Margaret asked, pulling back to look at her husband's face. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You remember my grandfather? The one who worked in the silver mines? Margaret nodded. She'd heard the stories countless times. Thomas's grandfather had been a mining engineer in the early 1900s, working the boom towns that sprouted up across the Nevada desert. He used to tell me about a place, Thomas continued, his eyes distant. An old mining settlement called Silver Hollow. Said it was built underground, carved right into the mountain. When the silver ran out in 1923, everyone just left. He said it was still there, preserved like a tomb. I always thought he was exaggerating, you know how old-timers are. But, he paused, I remember him drawing me a map once when I was a kid, made me memorize the landmarks. Margaret stared at him. Thomas, that was 60 years ago. You really think you remember? I remember everything he told me, Thomas said. He made me swear I'd never forget, said that place was sacred, that it held secrets. I thought he meant ghost stories. He looked at his wife. But what if he meant something else? You want to go looking for an abandoned mining town in the middle of the desert, Margaret said slowly. In November, when we have less than $2,000 and nowhere else to go. Thomas met her eyes. You got a better idea? She didn't. They both knew she didn't. That night, they loaded everything they owned into the back of the Ford truck. It wasn't much. Clothes, some photographs, a box of kitchen supplies, sleeping bags Thomas had kept from his Marine days, and a toolkit that Margaret had grabbed from the auction when no one was looking. Technically theft, but she'd stopped caring about technically. They drove out of town just before midnight, headlights cutting through the darkness. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with an old Nevada Road atlas open on her lap. Thomas drove with both hands on the wheel, his jaw set in that stubborn way she'd known for 50 years. "Northeast," he said. "Toward the old mining corridor. There was a rock formation Grandfather called the Three Sisters. Massive red stone pillars. The town entrance was supposed to be 5 miles east of that. They drove for hours. The highway gave way to smaller roads, then to dirt paths that barely qualified as roads at all. The truck bounced over ruts and rocks. Margaret's back ached. Thomas's knee throbbed. But they kept going. Dawn was breaking when they saw them. 3 massive red rock formations rising from the desert floor like ancient sentinels. The Three Sisters. Thomas pulled over and killed the engine. For a moment, they just sat there, staring. "You really remember this?" Margaret asked quietly. "I really do," Thomas said. "Every word he said. Every turn of the map." They got out of the truck. The desert air was cold and sharp. Margaret wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Thomas pulled a compass from his pocket, another relic from his Marine days, and checked their heading. "East," he said. 5 miles. Might take us a few hours on foot, but—" "We're not leaving the truck," Margaret interrupted. "If this is real, we'll need it. If it's not, we'll need it to get somewhere that is." Thomas nodded. They got back in and drove east, following what might have been an old mining road, or might have just been a dried riverbed. The truck groaned and complained. Twice they had to stop and push rocks out of the way, but they kept moving. It was mid-morning when Margaret spotted something. "Thomas, stop!" He hit the brakes. She pointed to a cluster of rusted metal half buried in sand and scrub brush. Old mining equipment, a cart, some kind of pulley system, the skeletal remains of what might have been a conveyor belt. They got out and walked closer. Behind the equipment, partially hidden by decades of desert growth, was an opening in the rock face. Not a cave exactly, too uniform, man-made. Thomas pulled the brush away, revealing more. It was a tunnel entrance, reinforced with old timber beams that somehow still held. Above the entrance, barely visible under layers of dirt and erosion, were carved letters, silver hollow. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God, it's real." Thomas stood there staring, his chest tight. He wasn't telling stories. They returned to the truck and grabbed flashlights, the sleeping bags, some water bottles, and the toolkit. Thomas also grabbed a length of rope from behind the seat. "Just in case," he said. The tunnel entrance was wide enough for them to walk side by side. The air inside was cool and dry, with that peculiar smell of old stone and time. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing walls that had been carved smooth, support beams that crossed overhead like the ribs of some giant beast. They walked for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 minutes. The tunnel sloped downward, taking them deep into the mountain. Then, without warning, it opened up. Margaret gasped. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks. Before them lay an entire town, underground, carved into a massive natural cavern so large their flashlights couldn't reach the far walls. Buildings lined both sides of a wide street. A general store, a saloon, what looked like a hotel, smaller structures that might have been homes. Everything was built from a combination of carved rock and old timber, and everything was still standing. "How is this possible?" Margaret whispered. Thomas moved forward slowly, his light sweeping across the buildings. The dry air, no weather, no wind, no rain. It's been sealed in here for over 100 years, perfectly preserved. They walked down what would have been Main Street. Their footsteps echoed against stone. Margaret's flashlight caught details that made her heart ache. A child's toy wagon sitting outside one of the homes, a sign advertising cigars for 5 cents, a rocking chair on what would have been a porch. "People lived here," she said. "Families, children. They built a whole community underground." "Had to," Thomas replied. "Summer heat up top would kill you. Winter cold the same. Down here, the temperature never changes. Always stays around 55, 60 degrees. They explored for hours. The general store still had goods on the shelves, canned foods, bottles of preserved items, bolts of fabric wrapped in paper. The saloon had chairs around tables like everyone had just stepped out for a moment. One building appeared to be a doctor's office, another a schoolhouse with slate boards still on the walls. But it was the boarding house at the end of the street that stopped them both. It was larger than the other buildings, 2 stories carved into the rock face with a timber facade. The door hung slightly open. Thomas pushed it wider, the hinges groaning. Inside, they found a lobby with a check-in desk and a staircase leading up. To the left was a dining room with long tables. To the right, a sitting area with furniture still arranged for conversation. "Thomas," Margaret said softly, "we could stay here." He turned to look at her. In the flashlight glow, he could see the exhaustion on her face, the way her shoulders sagged. They'd been running on fumes and fear for months. They needed rest. They needed shelter. "Just for tonight," he said. "Then we figure out what's next." They chose a room on the first floor, easier on Thomas's knee. It had a bed frame with an old mattress that surprisingly wasn't rotted through, a dresser, a small table with a chair, and a window that looked out into the cavern darkness. There was even a bathroom, though obviously no running water. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, testing it. It held. She let out a long breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for months. Thomas knelt in front of her, his hands on her knees. "We're going to be okay," he said. She touched his face, her fingers trembling. "Are we?" "Thomas, we're homeless. We're living in a ghost town. Our daughter betrayed us. We have no money, no future, no—" "We have each other," he interrupted. "We've always had each other. That's more than most people get in a whole lifetime." Tears finally came, the ones she'd been holding back since the auction. Thomas wrapped his arms around her and let her cry into his shoulder, her whole body shaking with grief and rage and fear. He held her until the sobs quieted, until her breathing steadied, until she finally pulled back and wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't you dare apologize," he said. "Not to me, not ever." They set up their sleeping bags on top of the old mattress for extra cushioning. They ate some crackers and cheese they'd brought. They talked about practical things, how to get more supplies, how long they could survive down here, whether anyone would come looking. But mostly they just sat together in the darkness, 2 people who'd lost everything except each other, finding unexpected comfort in a town that time forgot. Margaret woke first. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it came back. The underground town, the boarding house, the escape from a world that had chewed them up and spit them out. She sat up slowly, her back protesting. Thomas was still asleep beside her, his breathing deep and even. She let him rest. She took her flashlight and explored the boarding house more thoroughly. Upstairs, she found 8 more rooms, all furnished, all frozen in time. Some had personal items, hairbrushes, books, photographs in frames so old the images had faded to ghosts. She found a kitchen in the back with a cast-iron stove, pots still hanging from hooks, dishes stacked neatly on shelves. There were barrels in the corner that, when she opened them, contained dried beans and rice and flour, sealed so well they might still be good, though she wasn't brave enough to test that theory yet. She found a root cellar beneath the kitchen, accessed through a trapdoor. Climbing down, she discovered shelves lined with preserved foods in glass jars. Some had gone bad over the decades, but others, sealed properly, kept in the constant cool temperature, looked remarkably intact. There were also crates of candles, lanterns, lamp oil, blankets sealed in waxed paper. Someone had provisioned this place to last, to survive. She was about to climb back up when her flashlight caught something else. In the far corner of the cellar, almost hidden behind the shelving unit, was a door. Heavy, wooden, reinforced with iron bands. And it was locked with a mechanism she'd never seen before, some kind of combination lock, but instead of numbers, it had symbols. circles and lines and shapes that meant nothing to her. Margaret moved closer, her heart beating faster. She tried the handle. It didn't budge. She examined the symbols, running her fingers over them. They were carved deep into metal plates, deliberate, important. This wasn't just a storage room. This was something meant to be protected. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. "Margaret?" Thomas's voice called from above. "You down there?" She climbed back up quickly, her mind racing. "I'm here. I found the kitchen. Thomas, there's food, preserved food that might still be good, and supplies, candles, oil, blankets." He appeared in the doorway, his hair standing up on one side, his face creased from sleep. "Serious. Come look." She showed him everything, explaining how the cool, dry conditions must have kept things from spoiling. Thomas examined the jars carefully, his hardware store expertise kicking in. "These seals look good. Might be safe. We could test one, wait a day, see if we get sick." "There's something else," Margaret said. She led him to the cellar and showed him the locked door. Thomas stood in front of it for a long time, his flashlight beam steady on the strange symbols. "This is old," he said quietly. "Really old. Look at the metalwork. That's hand-forged. And these symbols," he traced them with his finger. "I've seen something like this before, in grandfather's papers. He had this notebook, kept it locked in a metal box. Sometimes he'd show me pages. They had symbols like these." "What did they mean?" "He said they were mining codes, ways to mark different shafts, different claims, different—" He paused. "Different treasures." The word hung in the cool air between them. "You think there's something valuable behind this door?" Margaret asked. "I think someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure nobody could get in here without the right knowledge," Thomas said. "And I think," he turned to look at her, "I think grandfather might have left me the key." They spent the rest of the day making the boarding house livable. Thomas managed to get one of the old gas lamps working using lamp oil from the cellar. The soft light transformed the room from creepy to cozy. Margaret cleaned and organized, her natural homemaking instincts taking over despite the circumstances. She made the bed properly with the sealed blankets she'd found. She swept the floors. She arranged their few possessions on the dresser like they were in a real home. Thomas explored the town more broadly. He found that the underground settlement was even larger than they'd first thought. There were side tunnels leading to what looked like mining operations, though the shafts themselves were blocked off. There was a stable area where they must have kept mules or horses. There was even a small chapel carved entirely from the rock, with wooden pews still in neat rows. But what interested him most was what he found in one of the larger buildings, what appeared to be the mining company's main office. Inside, there were file cabinets, desks, a large safe that was open and empty, and most importantly, a wall covered in maps and diagrams. He studied them carefully, his flashlight moving over faded lines and penciled notes. The maps showed the entire underground complex, not just the town, but the surrounding tunnel systems, the mining shafts, the ventilation systems. And in the margins, in handwriting, he recognized because he'd seen it in birthday cards and letters his whole childhood. His grandfather had made notes. Water source stable, airflow good, emergency exits marked, vault location confirmed, symbols match master key. Tell Tommy when he's ready. Thomas's hands shook as he read the words. His grandfather had been here, had known about this place in detail, had left him messages, left him information, assuming Thomas would someday find his way here. Tell Tommy when he's ready. He was 75 years old, homeless, betrayed by his own daughter, hiding in an abandoned mining town. If he wasn't ready now, he never would be. He went back to the boarding house and found Margaret organizing the kitchen. "I need to go back to the truck," he said. There's something I have to get." They made the trip together, walking through the tunnel to the surface. The afternoon sun was bright and harsh after the cool darkness below. Thomas went to the truck and opened a locked toolbox in the bed. From it, he pulled a metal container about the size of a shoebox, sealed with a combination lock. "What is that?" Margaret asked. "Grandfather gave this to me the week before he died. I was 15. He made me promise to keep it safe, to never lose it, to remember the combination. I haven't opened it in 60 years. "Why not?" Thomas looked at the box in his hands. "Because he said to only open it when I truly had nothing left to lose." They sat in the truck cab as Thomas dialed in the combination, his mother's birthday, encoded in a system his grandfather had taught him. The lock clicked. The lid opened. Inside was a leather notebook, its pages yellowed and brittle. And beneath the notebook, wrapped in oilcloth, was a strange key. It wasn't like any key Margaret had ever seen. It was circular, made of brass, with movable sections that could rotate, each section marked with symbols. The same symbols that were on the locked door in the boarding house cellar. Thomas lifted the key carefully, his breath catching. Margaret leaned closer. "He knew," Thomas whispered. "All along, he knew I'd end up here." They brought the box back down into the underground town. In the boarding house, with the gas lamp casting soft shadows, Thomas opened the notebook and began to read his grandfather's careful handwriting. The entries spanned decades, from 1915 to 1962, the year his grandfather died. They told the story of Silver Hollow, of how it had been more than just a mining town. It had been a refuge, a place where people who'd been pushed out by robber barons and corrupt officials could live free. The mines had been rich, incredibly rich, but the people who worked them had decided to keep the wealth for themselves, to create a true community where profit was shared. And when the surface operations started to fail, when the big mining companies tried to move in and take over, the people of Silver Hollow had done something radical. They'd hidden everything of value, sealed it away, and then quietly dispersed. They'd made it look like the town had simply dried up and been abandoned. But the wealth, silver, gold, cash, bonds, everything the community had earned was still here, hidden behind a vault that could only be opened by someone who knew the codes, someone who'd been trusted with the knowledge, someone like his grandfather, who'd been the mining engineer, who'd designed the locking mechanism, who'd kept the secret for 50 years until he passed it to his grandson. And now Thomas sat in an underground boarding house, his wife beside him, holding a key that could change everything. "Thomas," Margaret said quietly, "what are you thinking?" He looked at her, this woman who'd stood by him through wars and peace, through building a business and losing it, through raising a daughter who'd broken their hearts. This woman who deserved so much better than a cold room in a ghost town. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that maybe Grandfather was right. Maybe some things are worth keeping secret until the right person, at the right time, is ready to do something good with them." He stood up, holding the key. Margaret stood with him. Together they walked down to the cellar, to the locked door with its strange symbols. Thomas examined the key, then the lock, understanding now how they fit together. The key's rotating sections aligned with the symbols. He began to turn them, matching the pattern his grandfather had written in the notebook. One by one, the symbols aligned. One by one, mechanisms inside the door clicked and shifted. And then, with a sound like a deep breath being released after a century of holding, the door unlocked. Thomas looked at Margaret. She nodded. He pulled the door open. The door swung open on hinges that barely made a sound despite 100 years of stillness. Beyond it, stone steps descended into darkness deeper than their flashlights could reach. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of old coins and something else. History, preserved and patient. Thomas went first, testing each step before putting his full weight down. Margaret followed close behind, one hand on his shoulder for balance, the other holding her flashlight steady. They counted 32 steps before reaching the bottom. What they found wasn't what either of them expected. It wasn't a vault. Not yet. It was a corridor, maybe 20 feet long, with walls covered in detailed murals painted directly onto the stone. Scenes of people working together, miners with pickaxes, women washing clothes, children playing in the underground streets, families gathered around tables. And woven throughout the images were symbols, hundreds of them. The same symbols from the door lock, repeated in patterns that seemed random at first glance, but Margaret noticed had a rhythm to them. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her light moving slowly across the artwork. They documented their whole life down here. Thomas was examining the symbols more closely. "It's not just decoration. Look." He pointed to a series of circles and lines that appeared multiple times. "That pattern shows up in Grandfather's notebook. He called it a wayfinder." "A what?" "A map. But instead of showing geography, it shows connections, relationships between places." He pulled out the notebook and flipped through pages until he found a diagram. "See? Each symbol represents a location in the town. When you connect them in the right order, they create a path." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "A path to what?" "To other doors," Thomas said quietly. "Other chambers. Grandfather's notes say the people of Silver Hollow didn't put all their wealth in one place. They distributed it throughout the underground complex. Safety in separation, he called it. If one chamber was discovered or compromised, the rest would remain secure." They stood in that painted corridor for a long time, studying the symbols, comparing them to the notebook, starting to understand the puzzle they'd inherited. Finally, Margaret said, "We should probably see what's in this chamber first before we go looking for others." At the end of the corridor was another door, simpler than the first, with a traditional lock. Thomas used one of the keys from his grandfather's collection, and it opened easily. Beyond was a room about the size of their old hardware store's stockroom, and it was filled with wooden crates. Thomas approached the nearest one and carefully pried open the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and paper, were silver bars, dozens of them. Each one stamped with the Silver Hollow Mining Company mark and a year, 1897. Margaret opened another crate, more silver, and another, gold coins in sealed jars, and another, cash, old bills, carefully preserved, sorted by denomination. They worked through the room systematically, cataloguing what they found. By the time they finished, they'd counted 43 crates total. The precious metals alone would be worth a fortune, but there were also bonds, stock certificates from companies long defunct, and land deeds to properties throughout Nevada. Thomas sat down heavily on one of the crates, his bad knee finally giving out. "This is just one chamber," he said. "Grandfather's notes mention at least 5 more." Margaret sat beside him, her mind reeling. Hours ago they'd been destitute, sleeping in a ghost town because they had nowhere else to go. Now they were sitting on enough wealth to live comfortably for the rest of their lives, to help others, to maybe possibly find some kind of justice. "We can't tell anyone," she said suddenly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." Thomas looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. If word gets out about this place, about what's down here, we'll have treasure hunters, developers, the government, everyone descending on us. We'll lose control of it. And Thomas," her voice hardened, "Daniel will find out, and he'll find a way to take it from us. You know he will." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You're right. We need time. Time to understand what we have. Time to figure out the legal situation. Time to plan." He paused. "And we need to be smart about this. We can't suddenly show up in town with money. People will ask questions." "So we stay here," Margaret said. "We make this place livable. We figure out the rest of the chambers. And we take our time deciding what to do next." They shook hands on it, a solemn agreement between two people who'd learned the hard way that trust was earned, not given. Over the next few days, they fell into a routine that felt surprisingly normal given the circumstances. They woke with the day, even though day and night meant nothing underground. Thomas had found a wind-up clock in the general store that still worked, and they used it to maintain some sense of time. Margaret cooked meals on the cast-iron stove using the preserved supplies from the cellar, supplemented by occasional trips to the surface to get fresh water from a spring Thomas had discovered near the old mine entrance. Thomas spent his time exploring the underground complex, mapping it out, comparing what he found to his grandfather's notes. The town was larger than they'd initially realized. Over 40 structures in total, some residential, some commercial, some purely functional. And throughout it all, woven into door frames and carved into support beams and painted on walls, were the symbols. He started marking them using chalk he'd found in the schoolhouse. Each one he noted in a journal Margaret had discovered in the general store, blank pages waiting all these years for someone to fill them. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The symbols created pathways, just like grandfather had said. And if Thomas was reading them correctly, there were indeed 5 more sealed chambers scattered throughout the complex. Margaret focused on making the boarding house truly livable. She cleaned every room top to bottom. She sorted through the preserved goods, testing small amounts to see what was still edible. To her surprise, much of it was. The cool, dry conditions had basically freeze-dried everything. The beans needed long soaking but cooked up fine. The rice was perfect. Even some of the flour, once she sifted out the bugs that had gotten into a few barrels, was usable. She found linens sealed in waxed paper and aired them out. She discovered a remarkable collection of books in one of the upstairs rooms and started reading in the evenings by lamplight. She even found seeds, vegetable seeds in sealed tins, and started thinking about whether there might be a way to grow food down here with the right light source. But what occupied her mind most was the symbols. She found herself drawn to them, studying them during her daily routines, sketching them in the margins of her own journal. There was a logic to them, a language, and she was determined to learn it. One evening, as they sat together in their room eating a simple dinner of rice and beans, Thomas brought up something they'd both been avoiding. "We need to talk about Emily," he said quietly. Margaret's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully. "What about her?" "About whether we tell her. About any of this." "Absolutely not," Margaret said, her voice sharp. "She made her choice. She chose Daniel over us. She chose money over family. She's still our daughter." "Is she?" Margaret stood up, agitation making her pace. "The Emily we raised would never have done what she did, would never have stood by while her husband destroyed us. That person, whoever she is now, I don't know her anymore." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about how it happened, how we got here. And Margaret, I think—" He paused, struggling with the words. "I think some of this is my fault." She turned to stare at him. "Don't you dare! Don't you dare blame yourself for what Daniel did." "Not Daniel. Emily." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I was so proud when she brought him home. Successful, educated, ambitious, everything I wasn't. I thought she'd found someone who could give her the life we never could. I encouraged the relationship. Hell, I pushed for it." "Thomas." And when he started talking about helping with the business, about modernizing, about expansion, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe my daughter had married someone smart enough to take what we'd built and make it better. His voice cracked. "I signed those papers because I trusted him, and I trusted him because Emily loved him. And now—" Margaret crossed the room and knelt in front of his chair, taking his hands in hers. "Listen to me. You are not responsible for Daniel being a con artist. You're not responsible for Emily losing her way. You're a good man who saw the best in people, and there is nothing wrong with that. We lost everything because I was naive. We lost everything because bad people took advantage of good people," Margaret said firmly. That's on them, not us. And Thomas, she squeezed his hands, we didn't lose everything. We lost money and property, but we still have each other. We still have our integrity. And now, somehow, we've found this place. Maybe that means something. He pulled her close, and they held each other in the lamplight of a room that had been waiting 100 years for someone to need it. But even as they comforted each other, Margaret's mind was working. Because the truth was, she did blame Emily. And more than that, she was angry. Angrier than she'd ever been in her life. Their daughter had watched them lose everything and had done nothing, had probably known exactly what Daniel was planning and had stayed silent. And that kind of betrayal didn't just hurt. It burned. The next morning, Margaret decided to explore the town more systematically. She'd been focused on the boarding house, but there was so much more to see. She started with the general store, examining everything on the shelves. There were tools, fabric, dishware, even toys. Everything a community would need, all carefully preserved. Behind the counter, she found ledgers, and in those ledgers, written in careful script, were the records of a community that had pooled resources, shared profits, and taken care of each other. No one person owned the mine. It was a cooperative. Everyone who worked got a share. Families who couldn't work, widows, the disabled, the elderly, were supported by the community fund. Margaret sat on the floor of the general store reading these records for hours, and something shifted inside her. This place, this underground town, hadn't just been about surviving harsh conditions. It had been about creating something different, a place where people looked out for each other instead of exploiting each other, where wealth was a tool for lifting everyone up, not a weapon for pushing others down. It was everything her hardware store had tried to be on a larger scale. She took the ledgers back to the boarding house and showed Thomas that night. Look at this. Look at how they organized everything. This wasn't just a mining operation, it was a vision. Thomas read through the pages, his expression growing more thoughtful. Grandfather never told me this part. He talked about the town, about the people, but he made it sound like a normal settlement. He didn't say it was revolutionary, Margaret finished. Thomas, this is why they sealed everything away. This is why your grandfather protected it. It wasn't just about the wealth. It was about preserving the proof that this kind of community was possible. They stayed up late that night, reading through more of the town's records, piecing together the story. Silver Hollow had been founded in 1889 by a group of miners who'd been cheated by big mining companies back east. They'd come west looking for a fresh start and had discovered rich silver deposits in these mountains. But instead of repeating the same exploitative patterns they'd escaped, they'd created something new. For 34 years, the community had thrived. They'd built the underground town to escape the brutal surface temperatures. They'd developed sophisticated ventilation and water systems. They'd created art, educated their children, supported their elderly, and they'd done it all while being watched closely by mining interests who wanted to take over their claims. When those interests got too aggressive, when it became clear that Silver Hollow would either be absorbed or destroyed, the community had made a choice. They'd sealed their wealth, scattered to other towns, and let the world think the mine had simply played out. But they'd left the town intact, and they'd left instructions for how to access the sealed chambers, passed down through trusted members like Thomas's grandfather. A legacy waiting for someone worthy. The question is, Thomas said as dawn approached again, what do we do with it? Margaret didn't answer right away, but in her mind, ideas were forming. Dangerous ideas. Ideas about justice and legacy and making sure people like Daniel didn't always win. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Over the following week, Margaret became obsessed with the symbols. She carried her journal everywhere, sketching them, noting where they appeared, trying to decode their meaning. Thomas had shared his grandfather's basic translations, but Margaret sensed there was more to it. The symbols weren't just markers. They were a language, a way of communicating complex ideas through simple shapes. She found them everywhere once she started looking, carved into the wooden beams of the schoolhouse, painted on the ceiling of the chapel, woven into the fabric patterns stored in the general store, even pressed into the clay bricks that lined some of the buildings. And slowly, painfully slowly, patterns emerged. There were symbols for family, for community, for wealth, for protection, for time. There were symbols that meant hidden and symbols that meant revealed. And when certain symbols appeared together, they created directions, not just physical directions, but conceptual ones. Wealth hidden for future protection, or knowledge preserved for worthy finder. Margaret started mapping them obsessively. She covered the walls of their room with sketches and notes, connecting symbols with string like a detective investigating a crime. Thomas watched with a mixture of concern and fascination as his wife, who'd spent 43 years calmly running a hardware store, transformed into something fiercer, something driven. "You need to rest," he told her one evening when she'd been working for 6 hours straight without a break. "I'm close to something," she insisted. "Thomas, these symbols, they're not random. They're telling a story. The whole town is one big message, and I think—" She turned to look at him with wild excitement in her eyes. "I think it's a treasure map, not just to the chambers, to something else." "What else could there be?" Margaret pointed to a series of symbols she'd found repeated throughout the town. "This combination shows up 17 times. 17. And it always appears in significant locations: the chapel, the main square, the entrance to the mine offices. Your grandfather's notes don't mention it." "Maybe he didn't know about it." "Or maybe," Margaret said slowly, "it was something so important, so valuable, that it wasn't included in the general knowledge, something reserved for—" She paused, thinking, "for someone who earned the right to find it." Thomas looked at his wife's makeshift investigation wall and felt a chill run down his spine. "Margaret, what if this is dangerous? What if there are reasons some things were kept secret even from grandfather?" "Then we'll be careful," she said. "But Thomas, I've spent my entire life being careful, being sensible, following the rules. And where did it get us? We lost everything to people who didn't care about rules or fairness or decency. Maybe it's time we stopped being so careful." She had a point, and besides, Thomas could see there was no stopping her now. When Margaret set her mind to something, she was like water wearing away stone, patient, persistent, inevitable. So he helped her. Together they followed the mysterious symbol sequence throughout the town. It led them to the chapel first, where they found the symbol carved into the pulpit. From there, the pattern pointed to the schoolhouse, where it appeared on the teacher's desk, then to the doctor's office, where it was etched into a medicine cabinet. Each location yielded another clue, another direction. It took them 3 days of careful searching, but eventually the trail led them to a building they'd barely explored, what appeared to be a community meeting hall at the far end of the main street. Inside, the room was large and circular, with benches arranged in concentric rings around a central platform, and on that platform stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal sat a book, not just any book. A massive leather-bound volume with metal clasps and, carved into its cover, the symbol they'd been following. Margaret approached it like it was sacred. Her hands trembled as she undid the clasps and opened the cover. The pages inside were filled with the same careful handwriting they'd seen in the general store ledgers, but this was different. This wasn't accounting, this was philosophy, history, the complete record of Silver Hollow's founding principles, their challenges, their triumphs, and their eventual decision to seal everything away. And in the back of the book, written in a different hand, Thomas recognized his grandfather's writing, was a message. To whoever finds this place and takes the time to truly understand it, you have proven yourself worthy not through force or cleverness alone, but through patience, respect, and the willingness to learn. The chambers you have found contain material wealth, yes, but the true treasure of Silver Hollow was never in its silver or gold. It was in the idea that people can build something better, something fair, something that lifts everyone up instead of pushing most people down. If you've made it this far, then you understand this, and understanding is the first step toward doing. The chambers are yours to use wisely. But remember, wealth without purpose is just metal and paper. Use it to build something that matters. Use it to prove that the dream of Silver Hollow wasn't just a moment in time, but a seed that can still grow. And know that those who came before you are watching, hoping, believing that you'll do what they couldn't. Make the dream last. Margaret read the passage 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Thomas stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes wet. "They left this for us," Margaret whispered. "Not just the wealth, the responsibility." "The question is," Thomas said quietly, "are we up to it?" Margaret closed the book carefully and turned to face her husband. "I think we have to be. Because if not us, then who? If not now, then when?" They spent the next several days exploring the remaining chambers. Following the symbols, using the knowledge they'd gained from studying the town, they found all 5 of the other sealed rooms. Each contained similar wealth to the first: precious metals, cash, bonds, deeds. By the time they'd catalogued everything, Thomas estimated they were looking at somewhere between $250 and $300 million in total value. It was an incomprehensible amount of money. But as Margaret had said, it came with responsibility. And increasingly, as they spent more time in the underground town, as they read more of its history and understood more of its purpose, they both felt the weight of that responsibility growing. Thomas's knee was getting worse. The combination of cold, damp air and the constant climbing up and down steps was taking its toll. Some mornings he could barely walk. Margaret worried about him constantly, but he refused to slow down. "We're running out of time," he'd say, though he never specified what he meant by that. Margaret knew what he meant. They were 72 and 75 years old. They weren't going to live forever. And whatever they were going to do with Silver Hollow's legacy, they needed to do it while they still could. One night, lying in bed with the lamp burning low, Margaret said, "I've been thinking about Emily." Thomas turned to look at her. "Yeah? I want her to know what she cost us. I want her to understand that her choices had consequences, real consequences." "Revenge?" Thomas asked carefully. "No," Margaret said. "Truth. There's a difference." She paused. "But more than that, I want her to see what we're going to build with this. I want her to watch us do something good, something meaningful, and know that she could have been part of it, but chose Daniel instead." Thomas was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "That might be crueler than any revenge." "Good," Margaret said, and there was steel in her voice that surprised them both. The next morning, Thomas made a decision. "We need to go to the surface. We need supplies we can't get down here. Medicine for my knee, fresh food, batteries for the flashlights. And we need to start figuring out the legal situation." Margaret didn't want to leave their underground sanctuary, but she knew he was right. They couldn't hide forever. Besides, they needed to start planning. If they were going to honor Silver Hollow's legacy, they needed to be smart about it. They made the trip to the truck and drove to the nearest town, a small place called Cedar Springs about 40 miles away. Thomas stayed in the truck while Margaret went into the general store. She bought basic supplies, paying cash, keeping her head down. The clerk barely looked at her, just another elderly woman buying bread and aspirin. But as she was leaving, she saw a newspaper in the rack. The headline made her stop cold. "Local couple reported missing after business auction, family concerned." There was a photo, her and Thomas taken at the hardware store years ago, both smiling. Margaret bought the paper and hurried back to the truck. She showed Thomas the article. It was brief but concerning. Emily had apparently reported them missing 3 days after the auction. She told police they'd been despondent, possibly suicidal. There was an active search. "She's covering her tracks," Thomas said grimly. "If we turn up dead, she and Daniel inherit whatever's left. If we turn up alive, she looks like the concerned daughter." "What do we do?" Thomas thought for a moment. "Nothing. Not yet. Let them search. Let them wonder. Meanwhile, we go back underground and we plan." They drove back to Silver Hollow in silence, both of them thinking. The surface world felt foreign now, dangerous. The underground town, for all its strangeness, had become home. That night, Margaret had an idea. She went to Thomas with her journal open to a page covered in calculations. "What if we don't go public with the money? What if we use it quietly, strategically, to help people who've been hurt the same way we were?" "What do you mean?" "People who've been swindled, scammed, pushed out of their homes or businesses by predatory practices. What if we became their anonymous benefactors, paid off their debts, hired them lawyers, gave them the resources to fight back?" Thomas's eyes widened. "Like vigilante justice, but with money instead of violence." "Exactly," Margaret said. "We don't reveal ourselves. We don't seek credit. We just quietly, systematically help people who deserve help. People the system has failed. People like us." "It would take careful planning. We'd need lawyers we could trust, accountants, maybe investigators to find the right cases." "Then we hire them," Margaret interrupted. "We have the resources. Thomas, your grandfather said to use this wealth to build something that matters. What matters more than helping people fight back against people like Daniel?" Thomas looked at his wife, this woman who'd been so beaten down by the world, so betrayed by her own daughter, and who'd somehow found not bitterness, but purpose. "You're remarkable, you know that?" she smiled. "I'm just tired of good people losing." They spent the next week planning. Margaret created lists of organizations they'd need to contact: legal aid societies, elder advocacy groups, small business associations. Thomas worked on the financial logistics: how to move money without drawing attention, how to create trusts and foundations that could operate independently. And slowly, the shape of something emerged. Not just revenge against Emily and Daniel, though that would be a satisfying byproduct. Something bigger. A way to make Silver Hollow's dream live on in the modern world. But first, they needed to secure the town itself. They needed to make sure that when they did eventually reveal its existence, it couldn't be seized or exploited. That meant understanding property law, mineral rights, historical preservation regulations. It meant research, planning, preparation. It meant time. And time, Thomas knew, as his knee grew more painful each day, was the one thing they might not have enough of. Thomas's condition worsened faster than Margaret wanted to admit. By the 3rd week underground, he was limping badly, even with the walking stick he'd fashioned from an old broom handle. His breathing came harder after climbing stairs, and some mornings his hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a coffee cup steady. "We need to get you to a doctor," Margaret said one morning after watching him struggle to get out of bed. "Not yet," Thomas insisted. "We're not ready. If we surface now, if anyone finds out we're alive, Emily and Daniel will swoop in before we can protect this place." "Thomas, you could be having heart problems. Your knee might need surgery. This is serious." "So is $300 million sitting in an unprotected underground vault," he shot back. Then, seeing her face, he softened. "I'm sorry. I know you're worried. I'm worried too, but Margaret, we're so close. Another week, maybe 2, and we'll have the legal framework in place. We'll have contacted the right people. Then we can surface safely." Margaret wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in his eyes, and truthfully, she understood. They'd spent their whole lives playing by the rules, trusting the system, and it had destroyed them. Now they finally had the power to do something meaningful, but only if they were smart about it, only if they didn't rush. So she focused on taking care of him. She made him rest more, prepared nutritious meals from their dwindling supplies, massaged his knee with oil she'd found in the doctor's office, probably 100 years old but still fragrant with herbs. And she continued the planning, working late into the night by lamplight, sketching out organizational structures and legal strategies. But one particular chamber kept calling to her, the main vault, the largest of the 6 sealed rooms. They'd opened it once, catalogued its contents superficially, then moved on to explore the others. But something about it nagged at Margaret. There was more there, she was certain. Something they'd missed. On a Thursday morning, she thought it was Thursday anyway, time blurred underground, she went back to the vault alone while Thomas rested. She brought extra lamps and her journal, determined to conduct a thorough examination. The vault was massive, easily 40 feet deep and 30 feet wide, carved directly into the mountain rock and reinforced with timber beams. The crates they'd counted before were stacked along the walls, but now Margaret noticed something. The crates didn't fill the entire space. There was a gap, almost like a room within the room, in the very back. She moved carefully around the stacked wealth, her lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls. And there, behind the last row of crates, she found it. A section of the back wall that wasn't quite flush with the rest. Another door, hidden behind the stacks, camouflaged to look like natural rock face. Her heart racing, Margaret examined it closely. There was no obvious lock, no handle, just a small indentation at shoulder height. And within that indentation, carved so subtly you'd never notice unless you were looking for it, was a symbol. The same symbol from the book in the meeting hall. The symbol that meant truth revealed to the worthy. Margaret pressed her palm against it. Nothing happened at first. Then, with a grinding sound that made her jump, the rock face shifted. It slid sideways, revealing not another chamber, but a small alcove. And in that alcove sat 3 things: a metal strongbox, a leather satchel, and a framed photograph. Margaret lifted the photograph first. It showed a large group of people, men, women, children, standing in what she recognized as the underground town's main street. They looked happy, proud. At the bottom, written in faded ink, Silver Hollow Community, March 1898, united in purpose, equal in worth. She set the photograph down carefully and opened the satchel. Inside were documents, original deeds to the land above the town, mining claims registered in the names of every adult resident, equally divided, articles of incorporation for the Silver Hollow Cooperative, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, the complete official record of a community that had tried to build something different. And at the bottom of the satchel, a letter. Margaret unfolded it with trembling hands. "To whoever inherits our dream," it read. "If you are reading this, then you have found not just our wealth, but our story. You have taken the time to understand what we built here and why we chose to hide it rather than let it be corrupted. Know this, we did not leave because we failed. We left because we succeeded too well, and success draws predators. The mining companies wanted our claims. The government wanted our taxes. Powerful men wanted our submission. We gave them none of these things. Instead, we chose to vanish, to let the world think Silver Hollow was just another failed mining town. But we left everything intact as proof that a better way is possible. The wealth in these chambers represents 34 years of shared labor, honest work, and mutual support. Not one person among us grew rich while others starved. Not one family was cast out for being unable to work. We took care of each other, and in doing so, we built something worth more than all the silver in these mountains. We left it for someone like you, someone who has been broken by the greed and cruelty of the world above, someone who understands the value of what we created, someone who will use it wisely. Do not simply take the money and disappear. Use it to fight back. Use it to prove that people like us, ordinary, hard-working, decent people, can still win. Signed, the citizens of Silver Hollow, November 1923. Margaret sat on the stone floor of the vault, the letter clutched in her hands, and wept. These people had suffered. They'd been pushed and threatened and forced to abandon everything they'd built. And yet their final act hadn't been violence or revenge. It had been hope. Hope that someday someone would find this place and continue their work. She was still sitting there, tears streaming down her face when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Footsteps, not Thomas's uneven gait, multiple sets of footsteps coming from the direction of the boarding house. Margaret froze. Then, moving as quietly as she could, she extinguished her lamps and pressed herself against the wall near the vault entrance. Through the open door, she could see down the corridor toward the main street. And there, in the distance, she saw light. Flashlight beams sweeping through the darkness. And voices, familiar voices. Told you they'd be here. Where else would two broke old people hide, probably living like rats in the dark? Daniel, her son-in-law's voice, dripping with contempt. We don't know that they're here, Daniel. The truck could mean anything. Maybe they sold it. Maybe... Emily, shut up and keep looking. If they're alive, we find them. If they're dead, we find the bodies. Either way, we settle this today. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She had to warn Thomas, had to get back to the boarding house, but the vault was at the opposite end of town from where the voices were coming. If she ran, they'd hear her. If she used a light, they'd see her. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and began moving through the darkness. She'd been living here for weeks now. She knew every step, every turn, every obstacle. She didn't need light. The intruders did. She made it halfway down the main street, moving silently in her worn sneakers, when she heard Emily's voice again, closer now. Daniel, this place is incredible. Look at it, an entire town underground. If Mum and Dad really found this, it could be worth... Focus, Emily. We're not here to sightsee. We're here to find your parents and make them sign the dissolution papers. Once that's done, we can deal with... He stopped. Margaret had frozen, but her movement must have dislodged something. A small stone clattered across the street. What was that? Daniel's flashlight swept toward her position. Margaret pressed herself into a doorway, holding her breath. Probably just rats, Emily said nervously. Daniel, I don't like this. What if they really are dead? What if we find... Then we find bodies, and we look appropriately devastated. Come on. They moved closer. Margaret could see them now, Emily in expensive outdoor gear that looked ridiculous in the underground town. Daniel in his standard real estate developer uniform of polo shirt and khakis. He was carrying something, not just a flashlight, a gun. Margaret's heart hammered. She had to get to Thomas, had to warn him, had to... Margaret? Thomas's voice calling from the boarding house, confused, worried. Thomas, no, Margaret whispered, but it was too late. Daniel's head snapped toward the sound. There, the boarding house, move. They ran. Margaret ran too, no longer caring about silence. She burst into the boarding house seconds after Daniel and Emily, her breath ragged, and found them in the main room. Thomas stood near the stairs, leaning heavily on his walking stick, his face pale. Daniel had the gun pointed at him. Emily stood to the side, her expression caught between guilt and fear. Well, well, Daniel said, his voice slick with false friendliness. The missing couple. We've been so worried about you, haven't we, Emily? Mom, Emily said, her voice shaking. Dad, we were afraid you might have... Cut the act, Margaret said coldly, moving to stand beside Thomas. We know why you're here. The question is how you found us. Daniel smiled. Credit card trail. You bought gas in Cedar Springs last week. Small-town clerk remembered an elderly woman paying cash but using a credit card for the bathroom key deposit. We showed your picture around. Someone remembered seeing an old Ford truck heading into the hills. We've been searching for 3 days. And you brought a gun, Thomas said quietly. Interesting choice for a concerned family member. This. Daniel glanced at the weapon like he'd forgotten he was holding it. Just protection. These hills are remote, dangerous. You never know what you might run into. His smile widened. Or who? What do you want? Margaret asked. What do I want? Daniel laughed. I want you to sign papers transferring all remaining claims to the business property to Emily. Clean slate. Fresh start. Then you can go back to... He gestured around at the underground town. Whatever this is. We're not signing anything, Thomas said. Daniel's expression hardened. You don't have a choice, old man. You're destitute. You have no leverage. Sign the papers and we'll even throw you some money. Enough to get a little apartment somewhere. Live out your remaining years in peace. Peace, Margaret repeated. Is that what you call it? After you stole our business, our home, our savings? After you manipulated our daughter into betraying us? I didn't manipulate anyone, Daniel snapped. Emily made her own choices. She chose her future over your past. Smart girl. Emily flinched. Daniel, don't what? He turned on her. Don't tell them the truth. That you've known about every step of this. That you helped me plan it. That's not... I didn't know you were going to... Emily's voice broke. You said it was just refinancing. You said we were helping them. God, you're pathetic, Daniel muttered. Then back to Thomas and Margaret. Sign the papers, now. No, Thomas said simply. Daniel raised the gun, pointing it directly at Thomas's chest. I said now. Margaret stepped in front of her husband. Shoot me first then, because I'm not moving and we're not signing. For a long moment, nobody breathed. Daniel's finger twitched on the trigger. Emily made a small sound, halfway between a gasp and a sob. Then Daniel's eyes shifted, looking past them into the boarding house. What is all this? These maps on the wall? These symbols? What have you been doing down here? Margaret said nothing, but Daniel was already moving, pushing past them, gun still raised. He examined the walls of their room, covered with Margaret's research. His expression changed from anger to confusion to greedy understanding. These are treasure maps, he said slowly. Aren't they? This whole place. Jesus Christ, there's something valuable down here. That's why you've been hiding. That's why you won't surface. He spun to face them. What did you find? Nothing that belongs to you, Margaret said. Daniel laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Everything you have belongs to me. I own your business, your property, your assets. If you found something here, it's mine by legal right. Actually, Thomas said quietly, this land isn't part of what you seized. This is federal land, unregistered mining claims. Whatever's here belongs to whoever has claim to it. And we do. You don't. Daniel's face darkened. Show me. No. Daniel pointed the gun at Margaret. Show me, or I shoot your wife. Thomas moved faster than Margaret would have thought possible for a man with a bad knee. He swung his walking stick hard, connecting with Daniel's wrist. The gun went flying, skittering across the stone floor. Daniel roared in pain and fury. He lunged at Thomas, knocking him backward. The two men went down in a tangle. Emily screamed. Margaret dove for the gun. Stop! Emily's voice high and desperate. Stop it, all of you, just stop! But it was too late. Thomas and Daniel were fighting, grappling on the floor. Daniel was younger, stronger, but Thomas had Marine training from 50 years ago and the desperate strength of a man protecting what he loved. He got Daniel in a headlock. Emily, Daniel choked out. Get the gun. Margaret had already grabbed it. She pointed it at Daniel with shaking hands. Get off my husband! Daniel froze. Slowly, Thomas released him and rolled away, breathing hard. Mum, Emily whispered. Mum, please, put the gun down. Why? Margaret asked. and her voice was cold as stone. "So your husband can kill us? So you can finish what you started? Tell me, Emily. Tell me why I should trust anything you say." "Because I'm your daughter," Emily sobbed. "Because I love you. Because I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this," Margaret said. "Sorry doesn't give us back what you took." Daniel was getting to his feet, his eyes calculating. "You won't shoot," he said confidently. "You're not a killer, Margaret. You're a nice old lady who ran a hardware store. You don't have it in you." "You're right," Margaret said. "I'm not a killer, but I'm also not going to let you hurt us anymore." She shifted her aim slightly and fired. The bullet hit the stone wall 3 inches from Daniel's head. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Everyone froze in shock. "The next one won't miss," Margaret said, and her hands weren't shaking anymore. "Now sit down, both of you, on the floor, hands where I can see them." Daniel sat, his face pale. Emily collapsed beside him, crying. Thomas pulled himself up using the wall, wincing. His breathing was labored. "Margaret, I'm okay, Thomas. I've got this." To Daniel and Emily, "You're going to sit there quietly while we figure out what to do with you." But before anyone could move, Thomas made a small sound. His hand went to his chest. His face contorted. "Thomas!" Margaret's voice rose in panic. He tried to speak but couldn't. Then his knees buckled and he went down hard. "Thomas!" Margaret dropped the gun and rushed to him, cradling his head. His skin was grey, his breathing shallow and rapid. No, stay with me, Thomas, stay with me." "Dad!" Emily scrambled over, her face stricken. "Oh God, Dad, what's wrong?" "He's having a heart attack," Margaret said, her voice breaking. We need to get him to a hospital, now." For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then Emily moved. She pulled out her phone. No signal down here, but she was already running toward the tunnel entrance. "I'll get help. I'll call 911 as soon as I'm topside. Just keep him stable." Daniel started to follow her, but Margaret grabbed the gun again, pointed it at him with one hand while the other held Thomas. "You stay right there," she said. "You've done enough." Daniel raised his hands. I wasn't trying to." "Shut up," Margaret said. "Just shut up." She turned back to Thomas, stroking his face, whispering to him, "Hold on, love. Help is coming. You're going to be fine. We're going to be fine. Just hold on." His eyes met hers, filled with pain and fear and love. He tried to speak. "Margaret, the vault. Don't let—" "Shh. Save your strength. We'll deal with everything else later. Right now you just need to hold on." Above them, they could hear Emily shouting into her phone, her voice echoing down the tunnel. "Yes, a heart attack. We're in the hills east of the Three Sisters rock formation. There's an old mining tunnel. Please hurry." Daniel watched this all unfold with an expression that shifted between concern and frustration. Finally, he said, "I didn't want this. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." Margaret looked at him with pure contempt. "You wanted money. You wanted success. You didn't care who you hurt to get it. And now," her voice broke, "now my husband might die because of the stress you caused. That's not fair." "Fair?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "You're going to talk to me about fair? You stole everything from us, Daniel. Everything. And you did it using our own daughter." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Emily was coming back down the tunnel, half running, half stumbling. "They're coming," she gasped. "Ambulance and sheriff, 20 minutes. I told them exactly where we are." She knelt beside her father, opposite Margaret. "Dad, please, please be okay. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Thomas's eyes focused on his daughter's face. He reached up with a shaking hand and touched her cheek. Then his hand fell, and his eyes closed. "No," Margaret shook him gently. "Thomas, no, stay awake, stay with us." Emily was sobbing openly now, her perfect makeup running down her face. "This is my fault. All of this is my fault." "Yes," Margaret said simply, "it is." They waited in terrible silence for help to arrive. Margaret held Thomas's head in her lap, monitoring his breathing, talking to him constantly even though he didn't respond. Emily sat beside them, crying. Daniel stood against the wall, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably 15 minutes, they heard voices and saw lights coming down the tunnel. Paramedics appeared, professional and efficient. They took over, checking Thomas's vitals, starting an IV, preparing to move him. "We need to get him out of here," the lead paramedic said. "Is there a stretcher route?" "The tunnel entrance is wide enough," Margaret said. "Straight shot to the surface. Our truck is about 100 yards from there." They loaded Thomas onto the stretcher. Margaret walked beside him, holding his hand. Emily followed, still crying, and Daniel trailed behind, silent now, his earlier bravado completely gone. As they moved through the tunnel toward daylight, Margaret's mind was racing. Thomas might die, and if he did, Emily and Daniel would inherit everything, including the right to this land, to the town, to the vault. Everything she and Thomas had found, everything they'd planned to do with it, would fall into the hands of the people who'd destroyed them. Unless she did something about it. At the tunnel entrance, they emerged into harsh afternoon sunlight. The ambulance was waiting, along with 2 sheriff's deputies. The paramedics loaded Thomas into the back. "I'm going with him," Margaret said firmly. "Ma'am, we can only take one. I'm his wife, I'm going." They helped her into the ambulance. As the doors started to close, Margaret looked out at Emily, standing there in her expensive outdoor gear, makeup ruined, looking lost and broken. Their eyes met, and in that moment something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but understanding. Emily finally understood what she'd done, what she'd cost them, what she'd become. "Mom," Emily said, "I'm so sorry." Margaret's voice was cold as winter. "So am I." The ambulance doors closed. Through the small window, Margaret watched Emily collapse into tears. She watched Daniel try to comfort her and get shrugged off. She watched the deputies approach them, asking questions. And then they were moving, speeding down the dirt road toward the highway, toward the hospital, toward a future Margaret couldn't predict. She held Thomas's hand and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. "Please," she whispered, "please don't take him. Not yet. We still have so much to do." The heart monitor beeped steadily, and Thomas breathed, and the ambulance raced toward salvation. Behind them, hidden in the mountain, Silver Hollow waited, its secrets intact, its wealth untouched, its purpose unfulfilled, waiting to see if the couple who'd found it would survive to honor the legacy they'd inherited, waiting to see if hope could outlast heartbreak one more time. The hospital waiting room smelled like disinfectant and fear. Margaret sat in a plastic chair that hurt her back, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the double doors where they'd taken Thomas 3 hours ago. She hadn't moved except to use the bathroom once. She hadn't eaten. She'd barely breathed. Emily sat 4 chairs away, her posture mirroring her mother's. She'd tried to sit closer, but Margaret had given her such a look that she'd retreated. Daniel was nowhere to be seen. The deputies had taken him for questioning about the gun, about trespassing, about a lot of things. "Mrs. Monroe," a doctor emerged through the doors, still in surgical scrubs. Margaret stood so fast her vision swam. "Is he? He's stable," the doctor said quickly. "The heart attack was significant, but we got to him in time. We've inserted 2 stents and started him on medication. He's going to need rest, lifestyle changes, ongoing monitoring. But he's going to live." Margaret's knees gave out. She sat down hard, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming. "Can I see him?" "He's in recovery. Another hour or so. But yes, you can see him soon." The doctor paused. "Mrs. Monroe, I have to ask, your husband's medical history shows he's been under significant stress. Has something happened recently? Major life changes, financial difficulties, family issues?" Margaret laughed, a harsh sound. "All of the above, doctor, all of the above. The doctor nodded sympathetically. Well, moving forward, he needs to avoid stress as much as possible. I know that's easier said than done, but another episode like this could be fatal. After the doctor left, Emily moved closer. Mum, I'm so glad he's... Don't, Margaret said quietly. Don't pretend this didn't happen because of what you and Daniel did. The doctor asked about stress. Well, here's your answer. Losing everything we built, being betrayed by our own daughter, living in a cave because we had nowhere else to go. That's the stress that almost killed your father. Emily's face crumpled. I know, and I'm sorry. Yes, you keep saying that. Margaret finally looked at her daughter, really looked at her. And what she saw was a woman who'd lost her way so completely she couldn't find her way back. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I don't know, Emily whispered. I don't know how to fix this. You can't, Margaret said bluntly. You can't fix trust once it's broken this badly. But you can do the right thing going forward, starting with telling the truth. About what? About everything. About Daniel's scheme, about the forged documents, about every lie you helped him tell. Margaret leaned forward. Those deputies are going to question you, Emily, and when they do, you have a choice. You can keep lying to protect Daniel, or you can finally choose your family. Emily wrapped her arms around herself. If I tell them everything, Daniel will face consequences for his actions, Margaret interrupted, as he should, as you should. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept that. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Emily said softly, How did you know about the underground town? Thomas's grandfather left him instructions, a legacy passed down through generations, waiting for someone worthy. Margaret smiled faintly. Turns out we were worthy after all, despite everything. What's down there? Daniel kept saying there was treasure. There is, Margaret said, but not the kind Daniel understands. Yes, there's wealth, a lot of it, but more importantly, there's proof that people can build something better, something fair, something that doesn't require crushing others to succeed. Emily was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do with it? If Thomas survives, when Thomas survives, we're going to use it to help people. People like us who've been cheated and broken by people like your husband. We're going to create something that lasts, something that honors the people who built that town and hid their legacy for someone who would use it right. Emily paused. That's beautiful, Mom. It's justice, Margaret corrected. There's a difference. An hour later, they let Margaret in to see Thomas. He was pale and hooked up to more machines than she could count, but his eyes were open. When he saw her, he tried to smile. You scared me, she said, pulling a chair close and taking his hand. Scared myself, he managed, his voice weak. Thought I was done for. You're not allowed to be done for, Margaret said firmly. We have too much work to do. Did they? He struggled to get the words out. Emily, Daniel. The deputies took Daniel for questioning. Emily's in the waiting room having an existential crisis, and the town is safe. I didn't tell anyone anything. She leaned closer. Thomas, we need to act fast. While you're recovering, I need to set things in motion. The legal protection, the historical designation, everything we planned. Because if something happens to both of us, if we're not careful, this all falls apart. Thomas squeezed her hand weakly. Trust your instincts. You're stronger than you know. I know that now, Margaret said. You taught me that. These last few weeks, living in that town, uncovering its secrets, I found parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. Thomas's eyes drifted closed, but he was smiling. Good, use them. Over the next 3 days, while Thomas recovered under hospital supervision, Margaret became a force of nature. She contacted a lawyer, not a local one, but a specialist in historical preservation and mineral rights from Denver. She contacted the Nevada State Historical Society. She contacted a documentary filmmaker she'd seen on PBS. And she contacted the FBI. Because the more she'd thought about Daniel's operation, the more she realized it wasn't just about her and Thomas. A man didn't get that good at fraud through one scheme. There had to be others. Other elderly couples, other small businesses, other victims. The FBI agent who came to interview her was a woman in her 40s named Sarah Martinez, sharp-eyed and professional. They met in a hospital conference room with Margaret's new lawyer present. "Mrs. Monroe," Agent Martinez began, "you've made some serious allegations against your son-in-law, Daniel Westwood. Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Margaret did. She laid out everything: the manipulation, the forged documents, the power of attorney obtained under false pretenses, the draining of accounts, the forced sale. And she provided evidence: papers she'd grabbed from the hardware store before it was auctioned, bank statements she'd been collecting, emails she'd saved. Agent Martinez's expression grew more intent as Margaret talked. "Mrs. Monroe, I'm going to be frank with you. We've had our eye on Mr. Westwood for about 6 months. He's been operating a sophisticated elder fraud scheme across 3 states, but victims have been too scared or ashamed to come forward. If you're willing to testify—" "I am," Margaret said without hesitation, "and I think my daughter might be too." That afternoon, Emily came to the hospital room where Thomas was now awake and eating Jell-O. Margaret was there, as was the lawyer and Agent Martinez. "Emily," Margaret said, "sit down. We need to talk." Emily sat, her eyes darting between the official-looking people. "Mom, what's going on?" "You said you wanted to fix things," Margaret said. "Here's how you start. Agent Martinez is investigating Daniel. She needs your testimony about his business practices, his methods, everything you know. And Emily—" Margaret's voice softened slightly. "I need you to tell the truth. All of it. Not to protect me or your father, to protect all the other people Daniel has hurt and will hurt if he's not stopped." Emily looked at her mother for a long moment, then at her father, pale in the hospital bed, but watching her with something that might have been hope, then at Agent Martinez. "He has files," Emily said quietly. "On his computer, spreadsheets tracking multiple clients. That's what he called them, clients. Elderly people, small business owners, anyone with assets and not enough legal protection. He'd research them, find vulnerabilities, create relationships. He called it relationship farming." Agent Martinez was taking notes rapidly. "Where is this computer?" "Our home office. I can—" Emily swallowed hard. "I can get you access. I can tell you everything. But I need—" Her voice broke. "I need immunity. I didn't know how bad it was at first, and by the time I understood I was in too deep, I was scared." "That's something we can discuss with the district attorney," Agent Martinez said. "But Emily, I need you to understand. Your cooperation needs to be complete. Full disclosure. No holding back to protect yourself or Daniel." Emily looked at Margaret. "If I do this, Daniel will—" "Daniel will face justice," Margaret said. "And you'll face consequences too, but you'll also sleep at night again. Eventually, maybe." Emily nodded slowly. Tears streamed down her face. "I'm so sorry, to both of you. I got lost. I stopped being the person you raised, and I'm so sorry." Thomas spoke for the first time, his voice still weak but clear. "Emily, we didn't raise you to be perfect. We raised you to be good, and good people make mistakes. The question is what you do after." "I want to do better," Emily whispered. "I want to be better." "Then help us stop him," Margaret said. "Help us make sure no one else goes through what we did." Emily agreed to cooperate. Over the next week, while Thomas slowly regained strength, Agent Martinez's investigation expanded rapidly. With Emily's testimony and Daniel's files, they uncovered 17 other victims across Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. Elderly couples who'd lost homes, small business owners who'd been bankrupted, all following the same pattern: Daniel would befriend them, gain their trust, manipulate them into signing over power of attorney, and then systematically drain their assets. The total damage was estimated at over $12 million. Daniel was arrested on multiple counts of fraud, elder abuse, and forgery. He tried to implicate Emily as an equal partner, but her cooperation and evidence that he'd manipulated her too, including emails where he'd explicitly kept her in the dark about the scope of his operation, resulted in a plea deal. She'd testify against him in exchange for probation and community service. It wasn't enough punishment for what she'd done, Margaret thought, but it was something. Meanwhile, Margaret's other plans were progressing. The lawyer had filed paperwork establishing the Silver Hollow site as historically significant. The documentary filmmaker had visited the underground town, with Margaret as guide, and was putting together a proposal for a major series. And most importantly, Margaret had established a trust. The Silver Hollow Legacy Trust, funded by a portion of the wealth from the vaults, with a mission to provide legal aid, financial support, and advocacy for victims of elder fraud and small business exploitation. Margaret would serve as founder and director. Thomas, once he recovered, would handle financial oversight, and they'd already hired their first case manager, a young lawyer named Patricia, who'd been fighting these cases for years with almost no resources. Now she'd have plenty of resources. Thomas came home after 2 weeks in the hospital. Not to the underground town, the doctors were clear he needed easier access to medical care, but to a small rental house Margaret had secured in Cedar Springs. It was modest but comfortable, and most importantly, it was theirs. Their first night there, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas said, "Tell me everything I missed." Margaret did. She told him about the FBI investigation, about Emily's cooperation, about the trust she'd established, and she told him about the decision she'd made. "We're not keeping the wealth, Thomas, not most of it. We're using it exactly the way Silver Hollow intended, to build something better, to help people fight back, to prove that decent people can still win." Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How much are we keeping?" "Enough to live comfortably, to pay for your medical care, to make sure we're okay. Maybe $2 million set aside in a separate trust for us." She paused. "The rest, close to $300 million, goes to the foundation, to helping others." $300 million, Thomas repeated. "Margaret, that's a responsibility," she finished. "One I think we're finally ready for." He reached over and took her hand. "You know what I love about you? Most people find $300 million. They start thinking about mansions and yachts. You started thinking about justice." "I spent 50 years being nice," Margaret said, "being accommodating, playing by rules that were rigged against people like us. I'm done with that. From now on, I'm fighting back, and I have the resources to do it right." Over the following months, the Silver Hollow Legacy Trust began its work. They took on their first case, an elderly veteran in Utah who'd been swindled out of his home by a predatory lender. The trust hired lawyers, covered his debts, and helped him sue for damages. They won. The veteran got his house back plus compensation. The lender faced criminal charges. It made local news, then regional news, then national news. Couple who lost everything to fraud uses hidden fortune to fight back for others. The story captured people's imagination. The underground town, the hidden wealth, the betrayal by their own daughter, and then the decision to use their discovery not for revenge, but for justice. It was the kind of story that gave people hope. Donations started coming into the trust from ordinary people. $5 here, $20 there. People who'd been scammed or knew someone who had. People who wanted to be part of something good. Margaret hired more staff. They took on more cases. They helped a widow in Arizona who'd been tricked into signing away her husband's pension. They helped a small bookstore owner in Nevada whose property had been seized through fraudulent liens. They helped a retired teacher who'd lost everything to a fake investment scheme. Case by case, person by person, they built something. And the underground town itself? After months of legal wrangling, it was officially designated a historical site. Controlled access, preservation in place, with plans for eventual public tours. The documentary series premiered on PBS to critical acclaim. Silver Hollow, An American Dream Underground became required viewing in history classes across the country. But Margaret's favorite part was the museum she established in the old boarding house. Not a fancy institution, just a simple space where people could see photographs of Silver Hollow's original residents, read their letters, understand their vision of a community built on fairness instead of exploitation. And in the center of the museum, in a glass case, was the letter from the citizens of Silver Hollow, the one that had called Margaret and Thomas to action. Use it to fight back. Use it to prove that people like us can still win. They were doing exactly that. Daniel's trial took place 18 months after his arrest. Margaret and Thomas both testified, as did Emily and 16 other victims. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud spanning nearly a decade. Daniel was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, Margaret felt no triumph, just a quiet sense of completion. He'd face consequences. Other victims would see justice. That had to be enough. Emily was in the courtroom too. She'd served her probation, completed hundreds of hours of community service, and was now working as a victim advocate, using her insider knowledge of fraud schemes to help others recognize and escape them. She'd divorced Daniel, sold their house, moved into a small apartment, and started over. She and Margaret weren't close. Probably never would be again. But they were speaking, carefully, slowly, working towards something that might eventually resemble forgiveness. Thomas's health stabilized. He'd never be the man he was before the heart attack, but with medication, diet changes, and stress reduction, he was managing. He spent his days working on trust finances, reviewing cases, and taking long walks with Margaret through Cedar Springs. They'd bought a small house there, nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom ranch with a garden. Margaret planted vegetables. Thomas built birdhouses. They lived simply, despite having access to millions. Because that's who they were, who they'd always been. On their 52nd wedding anniversary, they returned to Silver Hollow. It had been nearly 2 years since they'd first stumbled into the underground town, desperate and broken. Now they walked through it as its official guardians, the people responsible for its preservation. They stood in the main vault, now empty except for documentation and photographs, the wealth redistributed to the trust and invested in helping others. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked. "Giving away the money? We could have kept it, lived like royalty." Margaret shook her head. "We're doing what we were meant to do. What this place was meant for. I've never been more certain of anything." They walked through the town hand in hand, visiting each building, remembering. The general store where Margaret had first found the ledgers, the chapel where Thomas had sat and prayed during his darkest moments, the boarding house where they'd made a home from nothing. And in the meeting hall, they stood before the great book. Margaret opened it to the page where her grandfather's message was written. But she'd added something new. Below his words, in her own handwriting, she'd written an entry. "We found this place when we had nothing. We were broken, betrayed, abandoned. The wealth we discovered could have been our salvation or our corruption. We chose to use it as it was intended, not to escape the world's cruelty, but to fight it. The Silver Hollow Legacy Trust has now helped 83 families recover from fraud. We've secured convictions against 12 predatory schemes. We've returned over $19 million to victims who thought they'd never see justice. This is what Silver Hollow's dream looks like in the 21st century. And we're just getting started." Margaret and Thomas Monroe, October 2024. Thomas read it and smiled. "Your grandfather would be proud. And the original residents, I think they'd be happy with what we've done." "I hope so," Margaret said. Because we did it for them, and for everyone else who's ever been knocked down by the world and told to stay down. They locked up the town carefully, making sure everything was secure. As they walked back through the tunnel toward daylight, Margaret thought about the journey they'd taken. From a couple standing in a parking lot, watching their life get auctioned off to guardians of a $300 million legacy used for good, it wasn't the ending she'd expected, but it was the one they'd earned. Back at the surface, they found a small crowd waiting. Patricia, their case manager, had brought 3 new clients, all victims of fraud, all desperate for help. There was a reporter from the Associated Press doing a follow-up story, and standing slightly apart, looking uncertain, was Emily. Margaret walked over to her daughter. "What are you doing here?" "Patricia called me, told me about the new cases. I thought—" Emily paused. "I thought maybe I could help. I know their tactics, how they operate. Maybe I could—" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "You can help." Emily's eyes widened. "Really?" "You said you wanted to be better. Here's another chance. We're not going to waste time on grudges when there's work to do." They walked together toward the group. Thomas joined them, moving slowly but steady. And for the first time in years, they felt like a family again. Not the same family they'd been. Something different. Something forged in fire and loss and hard-won wisdom. That evening, after everyone had left, Margaret and Thomas sat in their living room. It was modest but comfortable. Books on shelves, photographs on walls, evidence of a life rebuilt from ashes. "We should write it all down," Thomas said suddenly. "The whole story, for the archives, so people understand how this all happened." "People wouldn't believe it," Margaret said. "Couple loses everything, finds hidden fortune, uses it to fight back against the people who destroyed them. Sounds like a movie." "It's better than a movie," Thomas said. "It's real. It's proof that sometimes, when you've lost everything, you find what you were really meant to do." Margaret thought about that. About the girl she'd been in 1971 when she'd married Thomas. About the woman she'd become running a hardware store, raising a daughter, trying to do right by her community. About the person she'd transformed into when everything was stripped away. "We were good people who played by the rules," she said slowly, "and the rules failed us. So we made new rules, rules that actually protect people instead of just enriching the powerful. And we had $300 million to enforce those rules," Thomas added with a slight smile. "There is that," Margaret agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Margaret said, "You know what the best part is? We're not done. Every case we take, every person we help, every predator we expose, we're keeping Silver Hollow alive. Not as a ghost town, but as an idea. The idea that ordinary people can build something extraordinary if they support each other instead of exploiting each other." Thomas reached over and took her hand. 52 years married, and you still surprise me." 52 years married, and we're just getting started," she replied. Outside, the desert night was clear and cool. Stars filled the sky like promises. And in the mountains to the east, hidden beneath stone and time, Silver Hollow waited. Its chambers empty of gold but full of meaning. Its streets silent but not forgotten. Its legacy living on in every person the trust helped, every case they won, every time justice prevailed over greed. Margaret and Thomas had stumbled into that town broken and desperate. They'd found wealth beyond imagination, and they'd made the choice that defined them, not to hoard it, not to use it for revenge, but to honor the vision of people long dead who'd believed, against all evidence, that the world could be better. And day by day, case by case, they were proving those long-dead dreamers right, because anyone can find treasure. But it takes something special to use that treasure to lift others up. It takes the kind of strength that comes only from being broken and choosing to build something better from the pieces. It takes people who understand that the greatest wealth isn't what you keep. It's what you give away to make the world a little more fair, a little more just, a little more like the dream Silver Hollow represented. And as Margaret Monroe sat in her modest living room in Cedar Springs, Nevada, she knew with absolute certainty that she and Thomas had become exactly who they were meant to be. Not victims, not millionaires, not even heroes, really. Just two ordinary people who'd been given an extraordinary opportunity and had chosen to use it right. The girl who'd lost everything had found her purpose, and that purpose would echo long after she was gone, helping people she'd never meet, fighting battles she'd never witness, keeping alive the dream that fairness and decency and community could triumph over greed and cruelty and exploitation. She was 74 now. Thomas was 77. They didn't have forever, but they had enough time to make a difference, and they were spending every single day doing exactly that. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in vaults. They're found in purpose, in justice, in the choice to stand up when you've been knocked down and to lift others up instead of stepping on them to climb higher. Margaret Monroe had learned that lesson in the darkness of an underground town, and she was teaching it to the world, one helped family at a time. Because betrayal had brought them to Silver Hollow, but courage, love, and an unwavering commitment to doing right had transformed what they found there into something that would change lives for generations. The couple who'd been left with nothing had given the world everything that mattered. And they weren't done yet. Anyone can survive betrayal if they're willing to transform their pain into purpose and their loss into a legacy that lifts others. As morning light crept through the windows of the small house in Cedar Springs, Margaret Monroe wasn't reaching for a wrench or a business ledger anymore. She was reviewing case files, preparing testimony, planning strategy to help another family fight back against the greed that had nearly destroyed her own. The woman who once fixed broken engines had become the one who fixed broken systems. Because for Margaret and for every person, the Silver Hollow Legacy Trust would ever help. Justice wasn't just a word. It was a promise kept by two people who'd lost everything and chosen to make sure others didn't have to lose the same way. The betrayal that drove them underground had led them to a fortune, but the choice to use that fortune for good, that made them truly wealthy. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the truth deserves a voice.